I'm Nic Harcourt, and if you're a morning show listener, you've heard us play a couple of tracks from Thurston Moore's upcoming album, Flow Critical Lucidity. I'm happy to say that Thurston joins me to chat about the album and perhaps life in general. Great to see you.
Oh, it's great to see you, Nick.
We were just talking, it's been a while since I last saw you, 20 years, but talking of time, it's also been a dozen years since Sonic Youth paused, and from the outside, it seems like you're as prolific as ever. This new album will be your third in almost as many years. Last year, you released an autobiography, Sonic Life, a memoir. Looks like you stayed busy during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic allowed me to actually sort of really buckle down and write without too much distraction. There was no touring going on. There was, So yeah, I had already started writing the book before the hammer came down, and and then it just sort of, you lock the door. That was about it. I mean, I was a little bit. It was a little bit difficult because the libraries were all shut, and I was kind of dependent upon the libraries because I wanted to dig into the archives, mostly just so I could get everything chronologically correct in what I was doing. But by the end of the whole deal, when the libraries started opening up again, I was able to go in and do that. And it was fortuitous because I was writing in southern Florida and like South Miami in this area called Coral Gables, which is it figures in the book early on because that's where my family comes from. It just so happened that the library near there in Fort Lauderdale was the only library in the USA that had microfilm holdings of the entire historical run of the Village Voice,
Oh, wow.
which I really was dependent upon as far as really kind of mapping Sonic Youth's very first shows with some kind of accuracy. And so it was like a 30-minute drive from where I was. I mean, I was willing to fly to Michigan I mean, the New York library, God bless them, doesn't have the Village Voice electronically at all. They have a few spurious hard copies, but that's about
Wow, that's surprising, because it's such a part of New York, obviously, in Manhattan, the Village Voice.
yeah.
You would think they would have more of that stuff, maybe somewhere further down the track. Do you have journals to draw on? Or obviously, memory is a part of it. How did you pull all these disparate elements of the past together?
Usually through archives of ephemera. I mean, there's all the flyers, etc. And I do have a fairly good memory with it, I believe. I mean, everybody has their own sort of personalized memory of it, so it becomes a little foggy after a few years about where things land. So when I talk to other people in that lineage of the history, sometimes the stories would be in different places. Yeah. Well, I could have sworn it was,
Right.
1982 instead of 1983 kind of thing. And so I would have to, that was the reason I needed to really go in to do research so I could have receipts for the data. And so I kind of, and I really like doing that. I mean, I'm a bit of a record collector nerd. So I like to have the details. And so it was fun to do that. And also just go to like a site like newspapers.com, which is a pay site and it's not cheap, but it allows you to go through to access the digital archives of most every regional newspaper in the USA, reaching back as far as it can. It's hundreds of thousands of newspapers are available to sort of skim through. And to go through like regional newspapers across the USA in the early 80s and to see the little tiny little announcements for your gigs in these tiny little clubs and beer
Right.
halls that you would not have seen, at the time because you were either getting in, sound checking, playing, and getting out of there. And so you wouldn't really see any media really. You'd see a flyer or two, and all this stuff is really rarefied, and it was great to sort of uncover. Also, I was able to conquer a lot of mystery about, like, where we were on certain days. So that was fun, and I have folders of sort of, visual ephemera, arcana, reference materials. And the book could have been more just that, the book could have been a lot of things more. I was focusing on a lot of music essaying. I wanted to write about all the documents that were signifiers for me, like the great books, the great records, the great films, the great everything, so talking about like Patti Smith's Seventh Heaven book from 1974, 75, or Tom Verlaine and Richard Hell's book, Want to Go Out, that they wrote pseudonymously as Teresa Stern, and how important these were, and I really wanted to just talk about those things as opposed to talking about me, or even Sonic Youth for that matter. But I was contracted to write about Sonic Youth and a memoir about my involvement in all this kind of stuff. So, I had to sort of parse a lot of that out, but
I read an interview last night, a recent interview you gave to Christopher J. Lee, where you said that you wanted the book to have a benign energy, that it's important to resist the negative energy that's out there that's being parlayed into our culture, that you wanted it to be as celebratory. Is that how you say it? Celebratory?
celebratory?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, it's not funny, but I remember reading something that Patti Smith had written in the '70s in Cream magazine when she was a scribe writing for Cream magazine, and she mentioned something about like being a critic, whereas like the etymology of that word critic, from the Greek was all about this idea of celebration. You were celebrating this work, as opposed to, you know, analyzing it in a way where you're finding any kind of critical faults with it, or whether it's constructive or whether it's just sort of your own personalized take on it. Which I like music criticism and art criticism on all levels. I don't really. It's not that I didn't want to sort of get into the dirt with my own life and with Sonic Youth and sort of talk about things that I thought sort of had negative energy. I just wasn't interested in it. I found it really boorish to actually sort of expel that energy. It's also a Yoko Ono thing where she's like, talk about the good things as opposed to bad things and give that the energy. So even in the political sphere, she was like, well, let's talk about the good people in the political sphere as opposed to sort of railing against the bad actors in the political sphere. Let's not even talk about them. Let's talk about the good people and just sort of like and we're not really part of that industry anyway. We just sort of like, but we're definitely affected by it. But let's talk about the good things about it. And so that that was also a line of thinking. And I was like, well, I don't. There's only so much real estate in a book, so I was just like, I don't really want to sort of have that kind of energy in a book. I wanted the book to be totally just all about sort of the beneficence of what was happening in my life. There was a film that I saw once by a filmmaker who it was Jonas Mekas, the great New York avant-garde filmmaker. And it was a film that was 6 hours long, and it was all about bliss. And he said, I just wanted to make a film that I just filmed everything. I filmed my children sleeping. I filmed days on the beach. I filmed winter storms out the window. It was this endless film, but it was all about, and it was him just pontificating over it about like how beautiful everything was, regardless of how destructive it was. And the movie was all about just having a film that just dealt with bliss energy. And I thought that was really curious. It was like, why not? Why not have that exist in sort of dialogue with all the negativity that is constant being rammed into our down our throats every day? So I sort of took that as a measure of just like as an editorial measure, like why not do that? Let's just talk about the good things. I mean, there's some sadness in the book. There's some upsetting scenarios in the book, certainly, but I don't get in there. Certainly, there's no score settling or any of this kind of foolishness.
With that in mind of wanting to put out positive energy into the world, how does that translate into the music that you're making today?
Well, I always think the music that I make or I want to make is music that I would want to hear, and music that sort of is uplifting. Even when it sort of deals with uh, gloomier aspects, or even like more sort of nefarious kind of feelings. I embrace those feelings. I think sometimes they have a lot of just rock energy that I love. I mean, how can you not love Black Sabbath for God's sakes? I mean, that kind of negative nihilist energy that you find in music is like it's art, and it's a way of sort of expressing the truth of that emotion. So at the same time, I always feel that the music I make, and even all through Sonic Youth, was one about wanting to be uplifting, wanting to sort of empower this idea of just you know challenging not only the listener but yourself in what you're doing with experimentation and songwriting. You know, so that's how I always feel. I don't feel that much different at all than when I talked to you 20 years ago,
Right.
or when we started 40 something years ago, when I started actually sort of seriously engaging myself with the vocation of being a musician. It was all about that. It was all about, this raising of emotional consciousness, So yeah, that's still the idea.
So you've been living in London for a decade or more now, and I'm wondering how location impacts your art.
It always does. I mean, this new record, Flow Critical Acidity, was written uh, while situated around Lake Geneva in Switzerland at a writers' enclave. And other people were doing artwork, and there were some other musicians there who were into like sound art composition who were working on some pieces. Eva and myself were there, and I was writing music, and she was doing art and writing lyrics for me while I was doing that, and constructing a thematic record, which this record became. And so the actuality of being around this incredible lake, surrounded by these, you know, magic energy mountains of the Alps was really palpable. You could really feel it. And that really came into the music. And I brought the music to London. London is pretty gritty, especially where I recorded it in North London in this area of Stoke Newington and Dalston in a studio called Total Refreshment Center, which is a really fabulous, funky place. It's where International Anthem, the Chicago label, does a lot of their British recording and work and
Mm.
stuff. And I at the time, we were living near there. We lived there about 10 years, and, we recently moved to on the other side of the river. We're closer to I don't know if you know London so much, but we're closer to Hammersmith and Chiswick. And it's a different world over here. It's more suburbs. It's more like it's like a wetlands. There's lots of wildlife. There's lots of retiring people more my age with dogs, which it's quieter. It's less of a cityscape, which I've been wanting for a long time, because it's not exactly rural, but it's pretty suburban.
People have yards and stuff, and as you said, walk their dog.
Little yards. I mean, the dream is to like live in like northern Italy with and spend the rest of my days under an olive tree writing.
Me
Um,
too.
always a good time. Always, but we'll see. We'll see what happens in November.
Yeah, you said in the past that with Sonic Youth there was never a discussion about what a record was going to say thematically or personally. What about with your solo work?
Same thing, and I think it's the same thing for so many people. I was reading an interview recently with Nick Cave, and he was kind of expressing the same thing. And his records have such a sort of distinct kind of thematic vibes going through them. But it's like, what is he actually singing about? And he goes, I don't know. I mean, but I write these words and I write these lyrics, and they mean something to me, and it comes from my own interests, my own readings. It's not like it's not just dada happenstance. It's like they're you feel like you're writing uh, prose or poetry or lyrics, or even if you when you're writing narratives of fiction, it's like you kind of allow your imagination to sort of be the motor, and you have to sort of trust that kind of magic that happens there. And so I really like that. And I always found what was evocative about certain books or certain records was not necessarily the intention of what that writer or that composer meant, you know. The famous story of Brian Eno talking about all the lyrics on "Here Come the Warm Jets," where they were just sort of plays on alliteration and just like in funny phrases like "Burning Airlines gives you so much more," and "Baby's on fire, better throw her in the water," and all this kind of stuff. And it's like when I was a teenager, in the early and mid '70s, listening to "Here Come the Warm Jets" when it came out, I thought it was the most evocative and thrilling lyrical record. And to find out that it didn't really have any, kind of, proper narrative to it, I was at first, I was kinda let down, but then I thought like, "Well, no, that actually is really cool because it's all sort of sound based, and it allows the listener and myself included to sort of create their own sort of, imaginary, uh kind of ideas and concepts, what have you, with like hearing these lyrics. So it allowed the listener to have sort of this kind of playground. And I like that. I thought that was really smart. I thought that was really interesting. Not that I would have went, well, I actually feel like I do write lyrics like that sometimes, but not completely. But I know that other people do. Mick Jagger was talking about certain songs on XL on Main Street when there was a DVD about the making of it. And he, he talked about doing cut ups, that he was inspired by William Burroughs's and Brian Geison's idea of cutting up text and placing them together and creating like new sort of quote unquote magic narratives. Mick Jagger's doing that in the Rolling Stones, like the highest profile band in the world at the time, you know. So that's kind of it's not just, you know, weird art rockers like myself. Can I say weird, or can we do we still own the word weird? I don't
I
know.
I think that
It's
might have passed on to something else now. But, it's always interesting to talk to songwriters, about lyrics in particular, and again, at the end of the day, it's in the ear of the listener, isn't it? You know,
yeah,
however you're gonna interpret it, doesn't really matter how it was put together.
I guess not. I mean, sometimes the lyrics can be very sort of pointed and just very sort of political and what they're professing, or they could be something else entirely. I mean, Fugazi has this great song called Suggestion, which, the song is all about this idea of like the conflict of the power of suggestion when somebody goes out and then how they present themselves in the social sphere. It's a very, it's a very cool political tune. But when you read the actual lyrics of it, they're really obtuse and they're kind of strange. And you wouldn't sort of come to that conclusion that that's what that song is about, besides the title. And sometimes the title says it all. And then you can just sort of, you can just sort of spring from there.
Right.
But, sometimes the lyrics just tell the tale, like, straightforward. You don't have to sort of, it doesn't really stretch your imagination so much. But I personally think it's really interesting. I mean, I feel like imagination is like a muscle. It's really interesting to exercise it, with that exchange between the writer and the listener.
Well, the new album is called Flow Critical Lucidity. We've played a couple of advanced tracks on the morning show here. It's due out on September 20th. Thurston Moore, thank you so much for joining us on the morning show here at the SoCal Sound.
My pleasure, Nick. Yeah. I mean, anytime, you know where to find me.